My daughter-in-law looked at me across the Easter table like she was doing me a favor by letting me sit there. My son kept his eyes on his plate. And when she finally said what she'd been building toward all afternoon, she said it with the kind of calm that people use when they've already decided how the story ends. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. Welcome, friends. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 63 years old, and I want to tell you something before I get into what happened at that table. Drop a comment right now, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe, because you're going to want to know how this one ends. But first, I need to tell you about Margaret. Margaret Calloway kept a ceramic rooster on the windowsill above our kitchen sink for 31 years. She bought it at a church sale in 1989 for 50 cents because she said it looked like it had opinions, and she respected that in a rooster. Every morning for 3 decades, that rooster was the first thing she saw when she stood at the sink making coffee. She never moved it. She never replaced it. When I asked her once why she kept something so ugly in such a prominent place, she looked at me like I'd asked why she kept breathing, and she said, "Because it makes me smile every single morning, Ray." And that's not nothing. That was Margaret. She found reasons to smile every single morning, even the hard ones, even the ones near the end. She grew up in Denton, North Carolina, the oldest of 5 kids, and she put herself through community college working weekends at a dry cleaner, while her mother worked nights at a textile mill. She never talked about that time like it was hard. She talked about it like it was interesting. She'd say, "You learn a lot about people from their clothes, Ray. You'd be surprised." She had a memory for names that embarrassed me at my own business. She could walk into Calloway Woodworks after a 2-week absence and greet every employee by first name and ask about things she had no business, remembering a sister's surgery, a kid's baseball tryout, a father's retirement party. She wasn't performing. She genuinely wanted to know. We built the shop together, in the sense that I built the furniture and she built the relationships that made people come back. For 22 years on Route 9, outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Calloway Woodworks made custom cabinetry, built-ins, and furniture for residential clients, and we had a waiting list that most people in the trade would have given something real to have. That wasn't my craftsmanship alone. That was Margaret on the phone, following up. Margaret sending handwritten thank you notes after every installation. Margaret remembering that a client's daughter was getting married and sending a card 3 months before the wedding just to say congratulations. We hope the day is everything you've dreamed. She was diagnosed 14 months before she passed. Ovarian cancer, caught later than it should have been, moved faster than the doctors expected. She was gone 16 months ago. I am telling you about her because what happened on Easter Sunday happened in her house, at her table, with her good china that she bought piece by piece over 8 years from an antique shop in Lancaster. And the woman who set that table didn't know the first thing about what any of it meant. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 63 years old, and I've been running Calloway Woodworks since I was 38. Same building. Same hand-painted sign my father-in-law made the week we opened, because he said a business deserves a sign made with the same care as the work inside. I don't do things fast. I don't do things loud. I do them the way Margaret would have wanted, which is carefully and with some dignity. And most of the time that served me well. It stopped serving me the first time I let something slide that I should have addressed directly. My son's name is Patrick. He married a woman named Sandra Vale 3 years ago. Sandra comes from money in a way that she can't quite stop reminding you of. Not loudly, not with a list, but in the way she refers to things. The way she says "our people" when she means her family, and uses, of course, as punctuation when she's explaining something she considers obvious. She works in commercial real estate. She is very good at it, I'm told. And from the first Christmas she spent in this house, she made it quietly clear that she saw Calloway Woodworks the way some people see a horse and buggy on a modern highway. Quaint, slow, and in the way. Patrick didn't start out that way. I want to be honest with you about that, because my son is not a villain in this story, even if he acted like a supporting one for a while. He worked summers in the shop all through high school. He knows how to joint a board and cut a dovetail. He used to say he wanted to run the business someday. Then he went to Penn State, met Sandra, moved to Philadelphia, and took a job in corporate procurement. And somewhere in that sequence he started hearing the shop the way she described it. Small, Regional, not scalable. Last year, the words started coming up. Acquisition. There's a regional millwork company out of Reading called Hartwell Interiors. They buy small custom shops, keep the brand name for a year or two, fold the operations into their own, and move on. They'd reached out to me twice over the past 3 years, and I'd been polite both times and said no. I didn't need to sell. The business was profitable, the waiting list was healthy, and the 7 people who worked for me had been there an average of 11 years each. I wasn't interested in handing them to a company that would call them redundant before the ink dried. Patrick knew I'd turned Hartwell down. What I didn't know, until later, was that he'd been having his own conversations with them. Easter Sunday, April. My house on Cedar Mill Road, where Patrick grew up, and where Margaret planted the same garden every spring, tomatoes, basil, one stubborn rosebush she fought with every year. The table was set for 9. My brother Dennis and his wife, my sister Carol, my neighbor Ruth, who I've eaten every holiday with since Margaret passed, Patrick and Sandra's parents, Gerald and Patrice Vale, who drove up from Delaware and were on their second glass of wine before the ham was out of the oven. Gerald Vale is the kind of man who introduces himself with his former title. He shakes your hand and says retired CFO like it's a first name. He spent most of the salad course asking me questions about my revenue model that were dressed up as conversation, and I answered them the way I always answer that kind of question, honestly and without apology, because I don't have anything to be ashamed of. It was Sandra who brought it up directly, and she brought it up with the ham still being passed. She said, "Ray, I actually wanted to mention something while everyone's together, because I think it's good news and I'd love to celebrate it." She said it brightly, the way you announce an engagement or a pregnancy. Gerald leaned back in his chair like a man who'd been briefed. Patrick looked at the tablecloth. She said that Hartwell Interiors had come back with an offer. A real one, she said, as if the previous offers hadn't counted. She said it was generous, more than fair for a business of this size, and that their attorney had already begun reviewing the ownership structure. She said their timeline was hoping for a letter of intent by the end of the month, given the fiscal year. My sister Carol put her fork down. My neighbor Ruth looked at me. I said, "Sandra, I haven't spoken to Hartwell." She smiled and said, "I know, but Patrick has, and Patrick is your only heir, so it made sense to start the conversation." I want to tell you what that sentence felt like, because I've been trying to find the right words for it since April. It wasn't rage. It was something colder. It was the feeling of looking at a map you thought you knew and realizing someone had redrawn the roads while you were asleep. Patrick is your only heir, said at Margaret's table, with Margaret's china, like my son's inheritance was already a ledger item someone else was managing. Patrick still hadn't looked up. I asked him directly if this was true, if he'd been talking to Hartwell without telling me. He said, "I was just exploring options, Dad." He said it quietly. He said, "The business can't run forever. Someone has to think about the future." I told him the business was running fine. I told him I had 7 employees whose livelihoods sat inside that conversation he'd been having without me, and that I would appreciate knowing when my own son decided to negotiate with a buyer behind my back. Sandra said, "No one is negotiating, Ray. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to make sure that when the time comes, this transition is handled properly." And then she said the sentence that I keep coming back to. She said, "Margaret would have wanted what's best for Patrick." The table went completely quiet. She said Margaret's name, at Margaret's table, to tell me what Margaret would have wanted, as a way of explaining why I should cooperate with a plan my son had developed without my knowledge. Gerald took a small sip of wine. Patrick looked up finally, but at Sandra, not at me. My sister Carol said her name, soft, a warning. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to give them a chance to stop. I didn't take it either, if I'm being honest, because I didn't think there was anything to take. I wasn't going to apologize for being in my own dining room. I wasn't going to smooth this over so that the ham got eaten in peace, and we all pretended this conversation hadn't happened. I stood up. I said, "That's not a decision you get to make for her." I picked up my glass of water, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the sink for exactly 2 minutes looking at the ceramic rooster on the windowsill. It is still there. I moved it there, after Margaret passed, because I couldn't leave the kitchen empty of her entirely. I went back to the table. I told everyone to enjoy their dinner. I was pleasant for the rest of the afternoon in the way you are, when you've already made a decision, and you don't need to announce it. Ruth squeezed my arm when she left. Dennis said, "Call me this week, Ray." Carol didn't say anything. She just held my face in her hands for a second the way older sisters do when they know you're going to be all right, but they're sad about what it cost. Patrick and Sandra left without the conversation either of them probably expected to have. Now I need to back up, friends, because there's something you need to know before I tell you what I did the following morning. Her name is Helen Marsh. She was Margaret's closest friend from the hospital auxiliary. They both volunteered with for 12 years. And she lost her husband 4 years before I lost Margaret. So she understood the particular shape of the quiet that moves into a house when a person leaves it. Helen brought me a casserole every Tuesday for the first 3 months after the funeral, not because she expected me to eat it necessarily, but because she said a man should have a reason to open the refrigerator. She stayed for a cup of coffee, and we talked about nothing important, and then she left so I wouldn't feel crowded. She never asked me for anything. She just kept showing up. There was something else I'd known for a while and hadn't said out loud. Helen has a daughter, Claire, who has been asking about buying into Calloway Woodworks for 2 years. Claire is 34. She's a Finnish carpenter who came up working for a contractor in York and spent 3 years doing restoration work on historic buildings in Philadelphia before deciding she wanted to do custom residential work. She has the eye for it. I know because I've watched her work. Margaret knew too. She told me once, out of nowhere, that Claire Marsh was the kind of person a business like ours needed, and that we should talk to her seriously before someone else did. Margaret said a lot of things I didn't act on fast enough. That's the thing about grief. You realize later how much wisdom you left on the table because you thought there was more time. Monday morning, April 19th, 8:15, I called my attorney, a woman named Barbara Feinstein, who has handled every piece of legal paperwork connected to Calloway Woodworks for 16 years. I told her I needed to come in. She said, "This morning?" I said, "If you have it." She did. I sat in her office on Market Street with my coat still on because the building runs cold, and I laid out exactly what I wanted to do. I told her I was restructuring the ownership of the business before any external conversation could claim a stake in it. I told her I wanted to create a formal buy-in path for Claire Marsh that gave her a 30% equity stake over 5 years with an option to reach majority ownership at year 7, structured the way my father-in-law had structured my own buy-in from him when Margaret and I were just starting. I told her I wanted the scholarship fund we'd discussed before to be formalized, a fund in Margaret Calloway's name, administered through the Harrisburg Area Community College to support women in skilled trades, carpentry, cabinetry, construction. Because Margaret spent 30 years watching men underestimate women in workrooms, and she found it infuriating. And I told her that the path I had previously assumed Patrick would inherit the right of first refusal on any future sale was to be formally removed from any and all documentation. Barbara is not an emotional woman in a professional setting. She asked me twice whether I was certain, because that's what good attorneys do. I told her I hadn't been this certain about a business decision since we expanded the shop floor in 2007. She nodded and started writing. We filed everything by Friday afternoon. Notarized, recorded, done. Now here is the part about the clock. What I did not know until later, and what Patrick eventually told me himself, is that Hartwell Interiors had been counting on the estate valuation of Calloway Woodworks as part of a financing arrangement Patrick had entered into for a property investment he and Sandra were trying to close in Philadelphia. They had told their lender that the business asset was effectively theirs to leverage. They had done this before a single document had been signed by me. Before I had agreed to anything at all, the property deal needed to close by mid-May. When Hartwell called Patrick the following week to continue discussions and Patrick asked them to confirm the ownership structure, they told him there had been a change, that the business was under a restructured ownership agreement, that the right of first refusal he had been counting on no longer existed in any form, that they would need to speak to the current owner directly, and that the current owner had not been in contact with them. I found out later that Patrick received this call on a Wednesday afternoon. By Wednesday evening, I had 11 missed calls. By Thursday morning, I had 23. Sandra called twice, which she had never done before. Gerald Vale called once from a number I didn't recognize. And I only know it was him because he left a voicemail that began with, "Ray, this is Gerald, retired CFO. We met at Easter." As if I might have forgotten. By Friday morning, I had 31 missed calls and a text from Patrick that started short and became long, and then became short again. "Dad, call me." Then a paragraph. Then, "Please. I want to pause here and say something to anyone watching who has ever felt like the least important person in a room you built. You are not alone. Hit that like button if this is landing somewhere real for you. We're just getting started." I let most of those calls go, not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that, because I don't think cruelty is a plan. I let them go because I had already said everything I needed to say at a dining room table on Easter Sunday, and what I'd done at Barbara Feinstein's office on Monday morning was not a countermove. It was a correction. It was me finally doing what I should have done 2 years earlier, when I first noticed that Patrick had stopped seeing the shop and started seeing an asset. Saturday morning, 8 days after Easter, they came to the house. Patrick rang the doorbell, which he never does. He has a key. He rang the doorbell because he wasn't sure, I think, whether he still had the right to use it. I let them in. I put the coffee on. I am not a man who makes people stand on the porch when they've driven 2 hours, whatever else is true between us. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table Patrick did homework at for 12 years, and I poured 3 cups and I waited for him to start. He looked older than he had at Easter. That's the thing about a week of worry. It charges a toll. He told me about the property deal. He told me more than I think he meant to, the way you do when you've been holding something alone for too long and it just comes out in a rush. $160,000 was what they stood to lose if the deal fell through. The lender had already flagged the discrepancy in the asset documentation. Their attorney was involved. Things were, as he put it, complicated. I told him I understood that was a hard situation. I told him I was sorry it had gotten to that point. I meant both of those things. Then I told him what I'd done. The full version. Claire's buy-in structure. The scholarship fund. The right of first refusal. All of it. I kept my voice at the same temperature you'd use to explain a woodworking process, precise, unhurried, no more weight than necessary. Sandra asked if the filing could be reversed. I told her it was notarized and recorded, and that Barbara's office would be happy to walk them through the documentation if they had specific questions. I kept my voice level when I said it. There was nothing left to push against, and I think that was harder for her than if I'd been angry. Patrick sat with his hands around his coffee cup and said, "Dad, I was trying to plan for the future." He said it quietly. He wasn't performing it. He actually believed it. I told him I knew that. I told him the future he was planning for had my name on it without my consent, and that when you make plans with someone else's name without asking, you don't get to call that planning for them. You're planning for yourself and borrowing their credibility to do it. He didn't answer that. I didn't need him to. Sandra left first. She thanked me for the coffee, and I could tell she was working hard to keep her voice professional, and I respected the effort, even if it came too late. Patrick stayed. We sat at that kitchen table for another 40 minutes. Just the two of us. No third voice. No CFO. No Hartwell. No deal. Just my son and me and the ceramic rooster on the windowsill and 2 cups of coffee going cold. He told me he hadn't thought about the employees. He said it out of nowhere, after a long silence. He said, "I honestly didn't think about what would happen to Tom and Garrett and the others." He named them, my woodworkers, by name. That told me something. That he still knew their names. That the version of him who spent summers in that shop wasn't entirely gone. I told him they weren't going anywhere. That Claire Marsh was starting next month and that the Hartwell conversation was closed as far as I was concerned. I told him the scholarship fund was the thing I was most proud of, and I told him Margaret had wanted it long before I finally got around to making it real. He was quiet for a moment when I said her name, the quiet that still lands like a small weight when she comes up. Then he said he was sorry. Not about the deal, not about the lender problem. He said he was sorry for Easter, for what Sandra said at the table. He said she shouldn't have brought Mom into it. He said, "I should have said something when she did and I didn't, and that was on me." I told him I heard that. I told him I accepted it. I am not going to tell you that everything is repaired, because that's not how things like this work, and I don't think you'd believe me if I said it. What I can tell you is that Patrick called me the following Tuesday morning, on his own, without a problem to solve or a deal to discuss. He asked about the new shop layout we were planning. He asked how the rooster was holding up. He said he'd been thinking about coming up sometime to run the sander on a project, if I had something in progress that could use an extra set of hands. I told him I'd keep an eye out. Helen still comes by on Tuesdays. Claire Marsh started on the 1st of May and spent her first week reorganizing the finishing station in a way that made me think Margaret had somehow sent her specific instructions. The scholarship fund received its first applicant in June, a 22-year-old woman from Lebanon County who wants to do restoration carpentry. Her name is Andrea, and she reminds me a little of someone who used to argue with a rosebush every spring. I keep the rooster on the windowsill. I don't plan to move it. Here is what I want to leave you with tonight, friends. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet at that Easter table, where I let the ham get eaten and the wine get poured and I absorb it because making peace feels easier than making a point. I know that version. I lived adjacent to it for 3 years. And I can tell you that the quiet you buy by swallowing something that matters isn't peace. It's debt. It accrues. Eventually, someone borrows against it without asking, and then you're sitting at your own table wondering how your name became a line item in someone else's plan. You don't owe anyone your silence in your own house. A legacy isn't just money and square footage. It's the choice of who you trust it to, and why, and whether the person you loved would recognize the decision you made. Margaret would have smiled at that rooster this morning. I'm sure of it. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Tell me if you've ever had to hold your ground at your own table. Tell me if you've ever had someone use a name that wasn't theirs to use. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next story.